Against their wishes, most of the delegates of the National Convention had attended the Festival of the Supreme Being. To defy Maximilien Robespierre, to deny him this triumph, was not something any of them could contemplate. Robespierre was the most powerful man in France. As de facto head of the dominant Committee of Public Safety, leader of the Jacobin Club, and more recently, temporary president of the convention, to a certain degree, what Robespierre said, what he wanted, what he expected, was what happened. The examples of the Girondins, Hébertistes and Dantonists fresh in their minds, none of the delegates of the National Convention dared to challenge Robespierre out in the open. What they could do, instead, was signal their contempt for his recent religious antics. During the morning speech, several could scarcely contain their laughter. Later, atop the mountain on the Champ de Mars, the delegates had snickered and gossiped. Of course, when Robespierre turned to gauge their mood, the delegates were all nods and deference, but when his gaze was elsewhere, eyes burned holes in his back. The truth was that when Robespierre gave his famous speech on 20 Prairial, he was speaking only for himself and a narrow sliver of diehard supporters. To be sure, he was supported wholeheartedly by the sections, by the Commune, by the sans-culottes, but there were few anywhere in the government who truly believed in the vision of a republic of virtue, wherein revolution and religion were intertwined. And this fact was not lost upon the convention. For the first time, after months of waiting, they sensed that opposition was again feasible. Apart from Couthon, Saint-Just and a few others, the convention was unanimous. The cult of the Supreme Being was as absurd as it was dangerous. What excellent cover religion would provide for more purges on the grounds of impiety or lack of faith. And even if Robespierre wasn't planning a coup, his cult was a calamitous break with the revolutionary path. Thus the schism in the revolutionary camp that happened in the immediate aftermath of the festival was something Robespierre specifically hoped to prevent. Unity of purpose in line with his vision never materialized. Or at least, unity of purpose did not materialize for Robespierre, because there was certainly unity among a select few who would form the nucleus of anti-Robespierrist agitation. Most of them were members of the Committee of General Security. Despite General Security's legitimate claim to be one of the only two independent committees in France, they were instead dominated and undermined by Public Safety. Rarely had the two seen eye to eye, but the power dynamic favoured Public Safety, and so General Security never got its way. Things had become intolerable when Saint-Just founded the Police Bureau, intending for it to usurp many of the functions of General Security. Bad blood was only half the problem, however, as General Security was full of Robespierre's political rivals. The most important of these men was Marc-Guillaume Alexis Vadier, the man in charge of General Security. By 1794, Vadier had a well-earned reputation for ruthlessness stemming from his time as president of the Revolutionary Tribunal in Occitane. Contemporaries noted his zealous pursuit of all counter-revolutionaries, particularly the Girondins and later the Federalists. Rewarded for his service, Vadier was given a leading role in the Committee of General Security when it was formed in September of 1793. The hundreds of spies and informants under General Security's thumb answered principally to His Grey Eminence. Known for being able to consistently ferret out secrets, he earned the nickname the Inquisitor. This zealousness brought Vadier into conflict with the moderates under Georges Danton, and the two had clashed frequently. In one exchange, Vadier threatened to gut Danton, quote, the fat turbot. Danton's response was trademark. He threatened to scoop out Vadier's brains and, quote, shit down his skull. Needless to say, Vadier was not sad to see Danton go, and cooperated with Public Safety in bringing him to trial. In the months following, however, Vadier and Robespierre began to butt heads over everything. Bit by bit, General Security was undermined by Public Safety. Vadier fought back fiercely, never letting these encroachments go uncontested. The rivalry between the two contending committees mirrored the rivalry between their leaders, and Vadier became a focal point for Robespierre's worst suspicions. Another of Robespierre's rivals was a man named Jean-Pierre-André Aymar, who had made a name for himself as the right hand of revolutionary justice when working as a representative on mission. Commended for his thorough purging of Federalists and the like, Aymar was elected to General Security alongside Vadier. Working closely, the two developed a strong rapport. But where Vadier was an inquisitor, Aymar was a policeman, getting stuck into the nitty-gritty of arrest and imprisonment. That didn't make him any less zealous though, and he described the terror as, quote, a red mass, wherein justice was to be carried out on, quote, the great altar that was the holy guillotine. Feeling pretty secure, Aymar, just like many of his colleagues in other governing committees, took advantage of the East India Company's liquidation to skim it a little off the top. Once this corruption was found out, Aymar knew he was in for a world of hurt, and took a reflexive turn into moderation. Reporting on the affair, he tried to wiggle his way out by downplaying the scandal as nothing more than a matter of graft, rather than the foreign plot Robespierre asserted it was. Having run afoul of Robespierre, and being caught red-handed, it was by the skin of his teeth that Aymar evaded a guillotine. but he was still on Robespierre's shit list, a rival to be taken down. Also of General Security was a young propagandiste named Jean-Lambert Tallien. He'd spent the early portion of his revolutionary career producing pamphlets, papers and placards for the Jacobin Club. This garnered him some renown from the sans-culottes, and the feedback loop so common among the propagandistes, Tallien found his followers hungry for more radical opinions and gave them what they wanted, in turn becoming even more radical himself. After personally rallying the sans-culottes for the insurrection, he was given the secretaryship of the Insurrectionary Commune. Acquitting himself admirably, Tallien made a positive opinion on guys like Hébert and Danton, and later retired from the Commune for a gig in the convention. Soon thereafter, he was sent as a representative on mission to Bordeaux, embarking on a particularly brutal campaign of terror. This ran him afoul of former friend Danton, but Tallien found a new sponsor in Vardier, who poached him for a job in General Security in January 1794. In an ironic twist of fate, Tallien was convention president as Danton went to trial, and he oversaw the provisioning for the affair. All of this would, on paper, put him firmly in the Jacobin camp. But not quite. Robespierre was suspicious of Tallien for two reasons. Firstly, he had been an ally of Danton, and secondly, Tallien's tenure in Bordeaux had been controversial for reasons we'll get into later. It's enough to say that Tallien was ejected from the Jacobin Club on Robespierre's orders, later finding common cause with the Thermidorians. The last guy I'll mention is Philippe Roule. A former functionary in Alsace, Roule had been elected to the National Convention with the unique distinction of being the oldest member by quite some way, well into his 50s where most men were in their 20s or 30s. Despite his age, Roule was a proud Montagnard, hewing a fairly radical line. Later on, he would serve as a representative on mission, proving instrumental in the implementation of the Levée en Masse. By September of 1793, he was appointed to the Committee of General Security as one of the founding members, and immediately clicked with his like-minded colleagues. Things went well enough for a time, until, along with Lindet, Roule refused to condone the execution of Danton. Additionally, Roule was a supporter of the Constitution of 1793, which, as we'll see, got him into hot water with Robespierre. Opposition to Robespierre emanating from the Committee of General Security is unsurprising. And in the end, had opposition been contained merely to General Security, Thermidor may simply have passed as a month of the year, and not the coda to the French Revolution. But as it was, General Security was only the first axis of opposition. The second was the National Convention. Bearing in mind that the convention was made up of several hundred politicians, all with their own positions and opinions, their mood had generally shifted decisively anti-Robespierreiste by the end of June. For some, this was a position they'd been forced into, as they had a target painted on their backs. Joseph Fouché, for instance, was a prime target for Robespierre, as he believed Fouché, the original proponent of dechristianization, to be an irreligious, immoral apostate. He, along with other delegates fearful of Robespierre, formed the core of the convention's resistance. Over the next few weeks, they were joined by several dozen more who openly challenged Robespierre. These figures included Bourdon-le-Hoz, Jacques Thuriot, Pierre Roms, and Paul Barras, all four of whom had heckled Robespierre at the festival. In the immediate aftermath of the festival, these men did their part to sway the mood of the convention away from lukewarm support for Robespierre into staunch defiance. And this happened literally overnight. Robespierre awoke on the morning of the 9th to find that not only was General Security against him, but so too was the National Convention. Robespierre had only detected this shift after it happened. On the night of the 8th, retiring for the night, he had remarked to Dupleix, quote, "You shan't see me for much longer," as if in prediction of a grisly end. Even so, as the two axes of opposition, General Security and the Convention could only do so much. General Security was impotent, and the Convention, though it technically could block Robespierre's proposals, couldn't do much to challenge the emergency powers Robespierre wielded, and they allowed him to go over their heads should he wish. What really sealed the deal, what absolutely ensured that Robespierre was not going to be around for much longer, was opposition from within his own camp. Long had he spoken of the dangers of factionalism, and he now had to contend with one within his very own Committee of Public Safety. We have, first, the self-described professionals, Lazare Carnot, André Jambon, and Pierre Dehors. They were, above all, military men, and focused almost exclusively on the extremely taxing work of running the war effort. No time could be spared for petty squabbles or ideological differences. While that may make it seem like the professionals would stay out of any opposition camp, they were instead inclined to join, fearing that Robespierre himself was guilty of promoting the opposition they feared could undermine the war effort. In their minds, it was better to decisively solve these issues one way or the other, rather than drag them out to everyone's detriment. The group the professionals found common ground with was the bulk of the committee held aloof from Robespierre. The two big names here are Bertrand Barrère and Robert Lindet. While they too were focused on all sorts of administrative duties, both had politics on the heart and in the mind. They could claim to speak for most of the committee in their queasiness about the cult of the Supreme Being. The only members they could not claim to speak for were Robespierre's allies, Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, Collot d'Herbois, Georges Couthon, and Nicolas Billaud-Varenne. All four were conditionally on Robespierre's side, but that did not mean that there weren't misgivings. It's here that the ideological and temperamental differences became profoundly important. Disputes over policy and exact implementation grew more frequent, forcing Robespierre to crack the whip and get his guys in line. He felt that he could no longer fully trust his allies to stick to his vision. As it transpired, Robespierre's mistrust was ill-founded. Couthon and Saint-Just would remain loyal right up to the bitter end. Billaud-Varenne and Herbois would likely have remained loyal had not Robespierre driven them into the arms of the opposition, as we'll later see. Despite what I think you'll agree is a pretty broad range of anti-Robespierre sentiment, it was as yet still simmering just below the surface. Organising and active plotting were a ways off for now, but try telling that to Robespierre. At this 11th hour, he was feeling more hemmed in, more alone, more maligned than ever before. The previous few months had been hard ones. All of Robespierre's worst tendencies, his vanity, his lack of self-reflection, his moralism, and especially his paranoia, were in a heightened state going into May. And the May crisis had done nothing to deaden these fears. By then, he had delegated quite a bit of his duties to the other members of public safety, chiefly Couthon and Saint-Just. This was so that he could focus in on his religious objectives, but even shedding some responsibilities didn't leave him any less stressed. Every waking moment was spent working, whether it be developing the cult of the Supreme Being or scheming to undermine political rivals. Though Robespierre had friends and allies aplenty, he felt isolated from them. He even came to believe that many friends were his enemies or in league with counter-revolutionaries. Factions were the specific object of his ire, and Robespierre asserted again and again that all those who did not unconditionally support the Jacobins were guilty of, quote, moderantisme, moderation. A general, overwhelming sense of paranoia explains much of Robespierre's apparently self-destructive behaviour in these final few months. Some historians have even gone further and suggested that he may have suffered a mental break in an effort to explain why Robespierre's political intelligence seemed to have abandoned him. It's certainly possible. So much stress in a short space of time was bound to take a toll. Compounding Robespierre's many political problems were personal problems, namely his refusal to marry. In his moralistic mind, to take a wife would be giving in to pleasures he could not enjoy until the revolution was complete, if it ever was. Robespierre's conviction had been tested a few times though. Heaps of letters landed on his desk with proposals of marriage. Most had clearly misjudged Robespierre, and thought they could trade sex for a comfortable life. A few, however, were true believers. They offered comfort and camaraderie with fewer strings attached. One of these proposals came from an old woman named Catherine Thiot in mid-May. She was a true believer in the cult of the Supreme Being, and wanted to help Robespierre in this endeavour. He refused, of course, and though this little episode seems innocuous enough, it would come to haunt Robespierre. Harder to refuse was the hand of Eleanor Duplay. Their friendship had begun sometime in 1793, and Robespierre could count her as perhaps his only true friend, and that there was nothing political about their relationship. Marriage bells were ringing, but Robespierre nixed that idea early on, tempted though he was. It is for this reason that Robespierre garnered the nickname the Incorruptible. To make things just a little bit worse, Robespierre was the target of not one, but two assassination attempts in late May. Longiny feared the assassin's blade, but though these fears were strong, they were generally unfounded. That was until the days of the Great Terror and after the Constitution of 1793 was shelved. At that point there was a target on Robespierre's back. On May 23rd, a government employee named Amarant took 2 pistols and went hunting for Robespierre around the Tuileries. After waiting all day with no luck, Amarant settled for a shot at Herbois. He missed and was later wrestled to the ground by a brave stand-by, but it wasn't long before word spread about who the real target was. The very next day, Robespierre was in his apartment. It wasn't uncommon for him to receive visitors, members of the convention, public safety and general security, all of whom came to confer or deliver their reports. It was also not uncommon for members of the public to come to see Robespierre themselves, usually coming to offer their praise or ask for help. Cécile Renaud was presumed to be one such supplicant, but with memories of Marat's demise still fresh, she was stopped at the threshold and searched. In Renaud's possession were 2 knives. Turns out she was a crypto-royalist, and their intentions were, quote, to see what a tyrant looked like, before, you'd imagine, putting the knives to work. Upon hearing of this near miss, Robespierre took it as definitive proof that the foreign plot was alive and well. General Security was tasked with unearthing what they could about these recent plans. They discovered, to Robespierre's horror, that Couthon was on someone's hit list. Nonplussed about the whole thing, Couthon thought nothing of it, and naturally General Security detected no foreign involvement in the assassination attempts, despite Robespierre's insistence. Giving way, they did guillotine 40 prisoners in late May, including Cécile Renaud's entire family. Robespierre was profoundly shaken by his close calls. In a speech given in the immediate aftermath, he lamented to the convention that he believed the assassin's knife would find him sooner rather than later. This was a fear compounded by letters he received, almost constantly, from anonymous writers, who taunted him with hints of his demise. They claimed that even members of Robespierre's inner circle, even public safety, were members of a plot to overthrow him. One particularly chilling letter asked, "Will you be able to avoid the blow from my hand, or that of 22 others like me, who are as determined as Brutus and Scaevola?" The veracity of these letters is in doubt. He only received a handful, but either way they certainly indulged Robespierre's worst fears. He felt hopeless and under attack, admitting that he no longer believed he had, quote, the strength to combat the intrigues of the aristocracy. More than that, the letters seemed to prove that factions were many and they were actively plotting counter-revolution against the Jacobins. In order to prevent such coups from coming to fruition, Robespierre put Couthon to work drafting a reform package that would secure the total dominance of the Committee of Public Safety. Failure to detect, much less thwart, 3 assassination attempts in as many days betrayed the relative weakness of Robespierre's position. It's worth noting that despite appearances, he was not all-powerful. Very powerful, yes, but far from invincible. We're pretty clear on how his institutional backing from public safety was the basis of his power, and how that institutional backing was slipping by summer 1794. Well, another of his major weaknesses at the time was Robespierre's recent tendency to ascribe intentionality where there was none, and at the same time, not recognize the threatening way he appeared to others. For instance, some opponents made claims that Robespierre was a wannabe dictator, a Caesar in the making, something that Robespierre specifically denied. And when he said that, he meant it. He genuinely did not want to be in charge. But though he refuted claims of tyranny, he did nothing to change the optics which made such accusations credible. When Robespierre blew the whistle on factionalism, even though he had his own internal logic for why factions were damaging, he did little to assuage fears that going after factions was not just some veiled excuse to target political opponents. He literally couldn't conceive of the notion that others might have more than a slight disagreement on matters of great import. Robespierre took it as a given that the revolution had an obvious, natural direction, leading towards the Republic of Virtue, and so he neglected the work of compromise-based politics. In other words, Robespierre's political instincts were completely off the mark. As he was trying to see his Republican religious vision through to the end, he was doing so with a shrinking pool of political allies, while at the same time making enemies of those he just presumed were on board, when they really weren't. To whatever degree Robespierre was aware of his parlous situation, he certainly came to rely heavily upon the sections, the sans-culottes, and his friend Claude Payen of the Paris Commune. He needed the general revolutionary public more than ever before. Indeed, it could even be argued that Robespierre was at the height of his popularity. After the assassination attempts, he received 244 well-wishes and popular acclaim. Popularity ensured that the convention and general security, despite their growing hostility, had to presume the worst should they openly defy Robespierre. They had to presume that something like a journée would break out if they fired their shot and missed. But in relying upon his popular support, Robespierre fatally miscalculated how much the revolution still relied upon the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the new men of property. If I were to name names, he neglected to meet the needs of the Paul Barras, the Robert Lindays, the Alexis Vardiers of the world. The Festival of the Supreme Being had marked an unusually joyous moment for Robespierre. Despite returning home in a bit of a mood, the day after he was all roses. Joachim Villatte recalled that he was, quote, drunk on enthusiasm. With his energies restored, and still the president of the convention, Robespierre took full advantage. That reform package Couthon had been writing was now complete. The exact authorship is in doubt. Some historians contend it was written by Robespierre, in Couthon's name, others that the two conspired. Most likely Robespierre couldn't keep his hands off the draft, and edited Couthon's work whenever he felt it necessary. However it was, the package would do 2 big things. Firstly, it would establish a committee consisting of 60 jurors from the tribunal who'd work around the clock to sift through the evidence in a given trial. Their job was to determine whether or not the trial should go ahead, even going so far as to predetermine the suspect's guilt in cases where they determined the evidence to be overwhelmingly indicative of guilt. To help them determine what constituted guilt was the second part. It was a massive, and I do mean massive, expansion of the various crimes and infractions that were deemed serious offences. And serious offences only carried one punishment in France, a quick bit off the top from the guillotine. Now, Couthon was convinced that this sort of extreme measure was necessary to cut down on the caseload for the Revolutionary Tribunal. As it was, France had something like 80,000 suspects under lock and key in June 1794, with around a tenth of them in Paris alone. And though 40% would be acquitted, several tens of thousands of people, with hundreds more each week, was still literally years' worth of work before the tribunal in Paris, where they tried the political prisoners, and the other two in Flanders, where they tried common criminals. Cutting into this workload even a bit was seen as a big plus. But Couthon had more ideologically motivated reasons for proposing the plan. These were made plain to the convention on June 10th, 22 Prairial. With conviction, he declared that crimes of a political nature were far worse than mere common crimes because, where common crimes, quote, only harm the individual, political crimes, quote, threaten the existence of a free nation. Such crimes could not be tolerated, quote, indulgence is an atrocity, clemency is parricide. Essentially, he was saying that the reforms needed to bring the spirit and word of the law in line with their true purpose, to protect society, not those who threatened it. Then Couthon laid out the list of crimes which were now to carry an immediate death sentence. Any suspect who was brought up on any one of these charges was presumed to, quote, have made an attempt against liberty, unity, and the security of the Republic. They would either be pardoned, or if a quorum of jurors were convinced of their guilt, immediately guillotined. No evidence, no trial, no witnesses, no say from the convention. The law of 22 Prairial left everything down to the judgment of the jurors. Bearing in mind the problems Couthon intended the law of 22 Prairial to solve, it's also clear that Robespierre had his own plans for how the law might rid him of potential rivals. The purges of Ventos had failed to curb factionalism, and so this new approach was warranted. By casting a broad net regarding what was considered criminal, opponents and rivals could potentially run afoul of the tribunal. Moreover, revolutionary justice was hyper-centralized, the power of life and death in the hands of but a few men, with no oversight to keep them in line. Neither of these facts was lost upon the convention. They took umbrage at two key points. If speech that, quote, misled public opinion, or else impaired the, quote, purity of revolutionary principles, was now criminal, then the convention could no longer speak freely. The same would go for general security. Their independence from public safety from Robespierre would be at an end. One delegate, Pierre Rumps, boldly declared that, quote, there is nothing left to do but blow our brains out. Robespierre shot back that any delegate who rejected the law clearly had something to hide. The convention's other objection was that they were now cut out of the process of justice. Around a quarter were lawyers and thought it their rightful place to weigh in on matters legal. That too would be prevented by the law. Reticence to vote on the law was overcome when Robespierre finessed through a motion that the law be debated point by point and then voted on. These deliberations carried on into the next day, June 11th. Tallien pushed for the convention to retain some independence by reserving the right to try its own members separately and presumably under more lenient criteria. But Robespierre wasn't having it. He blasted Tallien in a series of crushing debates. And knowing all too well the fates of Brissot and Danton, the convention understood well the implicit threat if they failed to ratify the law of 22 Prairial. On June 12th, a reluctant convention revoked Tallien's amendment and ratified the law in its original, ambiguous form. This was a crucial victory for Robespierre. As far as he was concerned, if the cult of the Supreme Being was the carrot, the law of 22 Prairial was the stick. The people and the politicians knew well what constituted revolutionary virtue. They now also knew that there would be swift justice for failing to adhere to these virtues. Recall, if you will, Robespierre's words on May 7th. If the basis of popular government in time of peace is virtue, and the basis of popular government in time of revolution is both virtue and terror, virtue without which terror is murderous, terror without which virtue is powerless. Virtue and terror. The law of 22 Prairial trampled civil liberties and represented a sharp authoritarian turn. That it would even have benefits like emptying the prisons faster or intimidating counter-revolutionaries, these things were not the point in Robespierre's mind. They were the effects. He justified this as well as everything he did in terms of the ends justifying the means. Virtue and terror guaranteed the eventual attainment of the Republic of Virtue. For several delegates to the convention, the law of 22 Prairial was near as makes no difference a death sentence, despite the assurances of Robespierre, Couthon and Barrère that the Ventos purges had been the last. Jean-Baptiste Carrier and Joseph Fouché were among 6 or so men specifically targeted by 22 Prairial. Louis Fréron and Tallien were under the guns for their arbitrary conduct on mission. Critics like Paul Barras and Alexis Thuriot felt the same threat. By voting in favour of the law, they'd all placed the noose over their own necks. It was only natural, therefore, for anti-Robespierre's agitation to kick into overdrive. Robespierre was now able to crush dissent and eliminate rivals. Even so, in the days immediately following, the government was abuzz with rumours and agitation. government employees feared for their positions, all of General Security organised resistance, the convention stoked discontent and formulated a plan of action. Fouché alone put the fear of death into every delegate he could. Even the Committee of Public Safety itself was not immune. Apart from Robespierre, obviously, only Couthon and Saint-Just supported the law of 22 per hour unreservedly. The rest, however? Well, Billaud, Varenne and Aubois weren't thrilled, and Carnot, Priaulx and Day Barrère, well, they were in abject horror. The point has been made that this is a bit rich, as the committee was fine with the accelerated pace of arrest, trial, execution out in Flanders, something they'd all agreed was necessary. What had now changed was that the blade hung over their heads for the first time. But perhaps more than threats of death, none of the committee members had been adequately consulted. It's not known exactly what happened, but either Robespierre and Couthon went completely over everyone's heads to draft and pass the law themselves, or they had floated some of the ideas that would go into the law, but never actually debated these points. What is certainly the case is that Couthon and Robespierre signed the law of 22 per hour in the committee's name, in total violation of the opinions of the rest. The committee only worked as well as it did because the different opinions and experiences of all the members were taken into consideration when drafting laws. Breaking this covenant, making decisions without deliberation, shattered the committee's trust in Robespierre. That being so, the committee went to great lengths to maintain the illusion of a united front. In one instance, back in April, Saint-Just and Carnot had been knee-deep in a shouting match. Carnot exclaimed that Robespierre was, quote, an absurd dictator. An independent witness was sworn to secrecy. The cracks were widening. The professionals took a dim view of the so-called high hands of Robespierre, Couthon and Saint-Just, who either distracted the committee with political squabbles or wasted time and resources. The high hands, in turn, thought the professionals unmotivated, concerned with the war to the exception of all political matters. And then there were Billaud, Varenne and Aubois, who Robespierre came to despise for their prior support for dechristianization and credentials as Dantonists. As Prairial unfolded, he distanced himself from the committee and put in very little work, only penning 14 documents, but signing pretty well all of them. Couthon was similarly lax, writing only 8, and instead serving as something like the committee secretary. Saint-Just just put his signature on everything, but was absent from Paris as he was soon to go on mission. The law of Prairial went into effect straight away, bringing the Great Terror to its crescendo. More people would be executed in the last 100 days of the revolution than the prior 14 months. The ratio of acquittal to execution, roughly 3 or 4 executions for one acquittal, stayed about the same, but the sheer number of executions exploded from 155 in Germinal to 509 in the month of Prairial. Messidor would see nearly 800 executions, and before the Thermidorian coup, 342 people would be executed in about a week. To accommodate several dozen executions a day, the guillotine was relocated to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine for the sole reason that the drainage was better. Well, that and the bodies could be dumped in a nearby cemetery. Robespierre in that time retreated into his corner, continuing his work, rarely attending committee meetings, and living with one eye over his shoulder. Robespierre's circle of friends also shrank. Prosecutor Tonville, for instance, aligned completely with General Security. Robespierre became even more isolated when, on June 18th, his presidency came to an end. Even before then, he'd effectively boycotted the convention. He would only reappear before the convention on July 26th, and even then, only when summoned. Meanwhile, among all these subterranean axes of opposition, the Committee of General Security was the most unanimous in their desire to rid France of Robespierre, and as a result, they became the focal point for anti-Robespierreist resistance. Along with the convention, the rudiments of a plot were cobbled together. But as the opposition was not yet unified, these plots were haphazard and unfeasible. It's a small miracle none of them were ever detected. One such plot, concocted in late May, would have seen 9 members of the convention murder Robespierre during a debate, a la the assassination of Caesar. Indeed, to varying degrees, the plotters were aware that they were replaying that most famous of political assassinations. They were the Senate united behind Brutus, poised to destroy Robespierre, in their minds a French Caesar. And much like their Republican forebears, there was a lot of misgiving, backing out and infighting. Most plotters feared assassination themselves, and refused to return home of an evening. Fouché went everywhere packing heat, pistols hanging from his belt and coat. Defying the feelings of general insecurity among the opposition, General Security actually launched an effective counterattack to the law of Prairial. They spread the idea that Robespierre and Couthon were solely to blame for the law, again playing into fears of a dictatorship. It's important to again stress that the two possibly did confer with public safety, but deliberately misled them. Regardless, this secret attack was only a taste test for the public fusillade unleashed on June 15th. The story goes like this. From a rundown dwelling in Paris, an old woman named Catherine Théot had gained some notoriety. Afflicted by mental illness, she claimed to have gifts of predestination, healing, and whatever else, even going so far as to say that she would soon birth the Supreme Being itself. There was nothing inherently criminal in all of this. General Security simply monitored goings-on. Even as Théot gained some followers, they didn't try to stop her. But at some stage of their investigation, Vardier seized upon the idea that this Théot character could be the key to Robespierre's downfall. As previously mentioned, she had written a letter to Robespierre in May. Likewise, Théot's conspirator Dom Gerle was a former member of the National Assembly, and thus a distant acquaintance for the big man himself. Gerle even featured in David's The Tennis Court Oath. Vardier planned to discredit Théot and Gerle, paint them as counter-revolutionaries, and then by implication have that draw in Robespierre, a plan to corrupt the incorruptible. General Security stepped up its surveillance and sent out agents provocateurs, trying to get evidence that Théot's cult was counter-revolutionary, or influenced in some way by foreigners. They found no actual evidence of wrongdoing, so Vardier resorted to fabricating testimonies and documents. By June 15th, he had a case to present to the convention. After announcing the existence of a counter-revolutionary plot, Vardier revealed the cult's involvement with Robespierre. He claimed that Robespierre wrote to Théot, asking that she declare him to be the son of God. Exactly as Vardier expected, the convention saw the case for the opportunity it was. They voted for Théot and the rest to be arrested immediately, which General Security dutifully carried out. Not only did the Théot affair cast grave doubts upon the cult of the Supreme Being, and indeed, as was Vardier's ulterior intention, upon the viability of continued religious tolerance, it also gave the opposition a wedge with which to punish Robespierre. Things moved quickly, and pretty soon Prosecutor Tonville was gathering evidence in preparation for a trial. On the defense, Robespierre turned to public safety, but here the months of acrimony and his recent deceptions left him in the lurch. For days he tried to get the convention's decree overturned, but to no avail. Things came to a head on the night of the 26th. With only Couthon in support, Robespierre railed against all of his colleagues for several hours, accusing them of all manner of crimes and misdeeds. In the end they caved, preventing Tonville from continuing with the trial, but it was to be a Pyrrhic victory for Robespierre. It shattered what little unity yet lingered between former comrades in the committee. Billaud, Varenne and Aubois left the meeting with a newfound contempt for Robespierre, who they now deemed to be a moral coward. And aside from Barrère, who tried to mediate, the rest were now openly hostile. The Committee of Public Safety was all but lost to Robespierre. As Robespierre circled the drain, the fortunes of the Republic were on the up and up. Because on June 28th, 10 Messidor, only 2 days after the intercommittee breakup, France was about to achieve a stunning military victory that would break the back of the First Coalition. With frontlines stabilised, and as we'll get to, the French Navy rebuilt, the committee planned to relaunch their strategic offensives. From late 1793 through to early 1794, extensive preparations had been undertaken to ready the army and navy. This was made possible by Carnot's levée en masse, which reached peak efficiency over the winter. For the first time, they had a surplus of guns, ammunition, cannons, and boots, coats and uniforms to give the troops. Throughput, that is to say getting stuff to the troops, was the main bottleneck now, and it was a nice problem to have, all things considered. What bogged down preparations for the offensive was the domestic shortage of food, which, as we know, came to a head in May. Now the committee tried to rectify the situation by importing grain from overseas, a topic that intimately involves the navy. So before we get to the campaigns of 1794, we'll need to get up to speed on France's diplomatic and naval situation. Now the reason both of these topics are intertwined is down to the fact that France had to look across entire oceans for allies. On the continent, there was not a single nation favourable to them or their success. Only national minorities like the Poles and eventually the Catalonians were supportive, but of course these peoples didn't have an independent state to their name. Only 2 nations were vaguely sympathetic to the Republic. The first was the Ottoman Empire, a long-standing French ally, as both despised the Austrians. Their relationship had waned in lieu of the diplomatic revolution, but the committee was quick to rekindle the flame. These overtures, however, were disappointing. The Sultan would not risk war with Austria, as Russia was breathing down his neck. Nor would he risk the ire of the British, whose fleets dominated the Mediterranean. The best they could do is trade, and allow the various Barbary states of the Algerian and Libyan coasts to trade grain with the Republic. A new world away was the United States of America. On paper, they were a friend and ally. They had been quick to recognise revolutionary France. They had signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation in 1790. They traded with the metropole and French colonies. The Americans had done all of this eagerly, right up until King Louis's execution. Another republic in the world was cool, but one that killed kings, and which was at war with Europe. Despite Thomas Jefferson's insistence on American assistance, President Washington held the line with the Doves and refused French pleas for aid. Trade, though? That was all good. And that's where the Navy comes in, because it was the only means of ensuring a connection across the Atlantic. For over a year now, the Committee of Commerce and Supply had been conducting commerce in America with the intention of supplying France. They traded several $1 million worth of gold bullion for shiploads of grain. Instead of sending the ships piecemeal to be intercepted and seized by the Royal Navy, the committee wanted the 100-plus ships to depart all at once. Their destination was to be the port of Brest, though any Atlantic-facing French port was good enough. But Brest was ideal because in harbour was the French Navy. André Jeanbon had spent the last few months on mission trying his darndest to reforge the French Navy, much like Carnot had done for the army. Despite his truly magnificent efforts, Jeanbon was facing insurmountable odds. In late September 1793, what remained of the Royal Navy had defected. The mutinies at Quiberon deprived France of all but a handful of ships. So calling upon the resources of entire coastlines of France, Jeanbon had the French Navy rebuilt almost from scratch. There were some benefits. The French built excellent fast ships that were second only to those built by the British, and a brand new fleet of 25 ships of the line was produced in only 7 months. This included the flagship La Montagne, a 120-gun behemoth. Despite this effort, the quality of the crew was lacking, though not for want of motivation. So few officers and able seamen remained after the Quiberon mutinies that Jeanbon was forced to rely upon raw recruits. Among the 26 captains, all of these deficiencies were pronounced. Most were volunteers from the merchant marine, and it's not as though they could be trained because, in the narrow confines of Brest, there was no room to practice manoeuvres or gunnery. One of only 11 Old Guard captains was Louis Villaret-Joyeuse. Prior experiences involved escort duties for the merchants and the surrender of a frigate to the British in 1783. So Villaret-Joyeuse was not exactly cream of the crop. What recommended him was the fact that he had not fled. The French fleet put to sea on May 16th and went out to escort the American merchant convoy in for the last leg of their journey. Pierre Prieur arrived just in time, bearing orders from the committee, commanding the fleet to preserve its strength, come what may, and only give battle if the convoy was threatened. Prieur also delivered his heartfelt wishes to his friend Jeanbon, who had sailed with the fleet. Despite much fanfare from the locals, everybody, including the committee men, knew that the fleet was a little fish at the mercy of much bigger fish. That bigger fish was Lord Richard Howe, a seasoned admiral who we last saw all the way back during the American War of Independence, when he tangoed with the Comte d'Estaing. Howe had at his disposal 25 ships of the line, so about the same number as the French, but more than a dozen smaller razzies, frigates and sloops. Numbers only told half the story. All the British crews and captains were veterans. His scouts reported on the whereabouts of numerous dispersed French lines leaving Brest. Villaret-Joyeuse headed due west, but couldn't keep his formation intact. Individual ships fell out of line or charted their own course. Eventually, however, he reached a point approximately 500 miles northwest of Brest and awaited the convoy. Howe was not far behind, but for a few days Villaret-Joyeuse managed to avoid a pitched battle. A few inconclusive melees broke out, but always ended in both sides escaping under cover of dark. On May 31st, Villaret-Joyeuse was either caught by Howe or forced to give in to the demands of his captains and give battle. However it was, the Battle of 13 Prairial began not long after dawn. Both sides drew up in the typical line abreast formation, almost like two knights ready to joust. But after the first few broadsides were exchanged, something remarkable happened. Confident in the superior seamanship of his captains, Howe attacked into the French line. All of his ships, all at once, turned to face the French guns. This vulnerable position would have been disastrous in a lesser fleet. With the winds at their backs and good discipline though, the Brits barreled right on through the French fleet, scattering their ships. In dogfights lasting well into the night, French captains put up a tenacious resistance, with ships fighting it out to the bitter end. But it was hopeless. La Montagne itself came under the guns of half a dozen ships. Even Howe and the Queen Charlotte took a crack. The massive vessel fired continuously for several hours, sustaining casualties well over 50%. More than 300 sailors died, along with 18 officers, including the captain. Villaret-Joyeuse extracted what ships he could and then fled, leaving behind 7 stricken ships, of which the Vengeur de Paup sank with all hands. In a roundabout way, Villaret-Joyeuse and Jeanbon completed their mission. Reaching the safety of Brest on June 11th, they immediately salvaged what men and ships they could and put to sea. The fear now was that Howe would be free to intercept the convoy, which was expected to arrive imminently. As it was, Howe was so preoccupied with 6 captured ships and the heavy casualties his own ships had taken that he had to pull back to Portsmouth. Thus the convoy slipped by completely unmolested. In fact, they had been in the area where the battle occurred only 2 days before it happened. Escorted by 4 French warships, 116 American boats bearing 24 million pounds of flour docked in Brest on the 13th. Jean Bon relayed this fortunate news to the committee. Their immediate reaction was mixed, but in the coming weeks their mood softened. At the end of the day, despite taking a licking, the fleet had done its job. Moreover, there was significant propaganda value. Even British tabloids reported on the bravery of French sailors, claiming that the Vengeur went to the bottom with its crew singing La Marseillaise. Barrère was quick to embellish these stories to the convention, who groaned at his obvious lies. Priaulx stayed on in Brest for a while to help with the distribution of bread, while Jean Bon went back to Paris in late June, just in time for the intercommittee row that occurred on June 26th. He probably would have preferred to face British cannon than Parisian politics. American grain and a good harvest meant that offensives on land could continue. We turn now to the Pyrenees for the Catalan campaign. Despite the upheaval caused by musical chairs played amongst the local generals, the French had repelled Spanish attacks at the eastern and western ends of the Pyrenees. Things settled into a lull over winter, only broken when the Spanish made a push into the Basque country. They had some success, and found the Basque to be supportive, much like the Catalonian population had been in the east. But harsh measures from the French, as well as their staunch defence, thwarted the Spanish advance. The general in command of the Army of the Western Pyrenees, Jeannot de Moncy, launched his own counter-invasion in late July, scoring a victory at Batzan that opened up all of Navarra. By year's end, the Spanish were the ones desperately clinging to their hill forts and redoubts. Ironically enough, the Basque came to prefer the French over the Spanish. The whole situation was mirrored almost exactly to the east. Jean-François Dugommier, fresh from his victory at Toulon, was given command of the Army of the Eastern Pyrenees, following the death of its previous commander. He battled his way across the frontier, struggling against De la Unión, a very capable commander in charge of the Spanish, Portuguese and French royalist forces defending Catalonia. From May to September, Dugommier was busy with the siege of Bellegarde, but had to fend off Unión's numerous relief attempts. Pierre Augereau, a man you'll hear about again, proved decisive in these engagements. When Bellegarde fell, the French found warehouses chock full of enough gunpowder and shot to sustain the entire campaign. They were aided further still by the revolutionary Catalonians. Many liked the sounds of the rights of man and offered support in exchange for autonomy under the Republic. The Catalonia campaign was decided at the Battle of Black Mountain. In something straight out of a novel, Dugommier and Unión fought for 3 hellish days. On the first day, Dugommier was blasted to bits by a cannonball. The French fought on regardless, and on the final day of the battle, when the Spanish were on the ropes, Unión led a final assault. He too bit the bullet. Command of the armies fell to subordinates, who duked it out until July 1795, when the war ended. As the Catalonia campaign raged, the campaign in Italy resumed. And this was in part at the insistence of Augustin Robespierre, a representative on mission to the Army of Italy. Not a military man, and it's going to show, Augustin describes Genoa as ripe for the plucking. The Entree port on the Ligurian coast supplied most of the food and British subsidies needed to sustain the Piemontese army. Should the port fall, the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont would surely collapse. Despite that, Robespierre the Elder wanted a complacent Genoa as a source of credit and grain. Plans were thus drawn up by the Bureau of Maps for another Alpine invasion, despite serious reservations from a young Napoleon, rewarded for his service at Toulon with a desk job in Paris. A lowly captain hardly figured into the grand plans of the Robespierres, and by April, the invasion had commenced. At first, the going was good. The French quickly occupied the mountain forts, sending 40,000 locals scurrying for their lives. Pretty soon, however, the French were floundering. Of all the armies, the Army of Italy was neglected in all aspects. Pay was in arrears, uniforms were tattered, the men had no boots, guns and ammunition were in short supply. So under-provisioned were the troops that they resorted to looting the mountain for food, but of course these were mountains and they found bugger all. By June they were starving, as Augustin appealed for an invasion into the Republic of Genoa. His brother thought a policy of antagonism might do the trick. The Genovese ambassador was summoned to the committee to answer for his government's failure to pay its debts. Unable to offer a sufficient explanation, he was heckled mercilessly. Still, Italy was a backwater, and Augustin was only given the aid of Bonaparte in drafting plans. Going a little bit further than his purview, Bonaparte crafted plans for a full-scale invasion of all northern Italy. Arriving at the front in September, he and Augustin were present at the Battle of Dego, in which an Austrian army was prevented from ejecting the French from the mountains. Despite the victory, Napoleon's grand plan was dropped. The state of the army precluded any notion of an offensive. The French withdrew back across the border by the end of year 2, having achieved nothing. Where the Italian campaign had been a disappointing failure, the main event up in the northeast was about to decide the entire war. By 1794, the French army numbered around 800,000 men under arms, and the best led, equipped and most experienced fought in the field armies of the north and east. The Army of the North was commanded by Jean-Charles Pichegru, a proven general and reliable Jacobin, from April onwards. He relieved Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, who was, if you remember, recalled to Paris to face Carnot's justice. As it turned out, despite having no qualms about killing generals, the committee couldn't afford to kill any more capable generals. Temporarily relieved of duty, Jourdan was reinstated in May and given command of the Army of the Moselle. This proved to be a very good choice. Between Pichegru and Jourdan, as well as a few supporting armies like that of the Vosges and the Ardennes, they had around 200,000 men. Most of the problems with the army had been ironed out by now. The troops were properly equipped and trained, ammunition and weapons were plentiful. The only problem was food, a problem that prevented the offensive until June. Despite their initial advantages, the coalition was by then undermined by many of the same perils the French had overcome. The greatest by far was operational cohesion. Field Marshal Mack of Austria conceived of a grand plan that would surely deliver a stunning victory. But by the time it was ready, the Prussian-Austrian alliance was in tatters. Forgetting Pillnitz and Padua, old animosities reasserted themselves amidst the difficulties wrought by war. Prussia's heart wasn't really in it anymore. Tasked with defending the Rhineland, the morale of their troops was sapped. In no condition to go on the attack, they refused to sign on to Mack's plan. Austria then nixed British plans to subsidize fully 100,000 Prussian troops. This was partly a screw you, but also a cynical calculation. It was the fear of the Austrian Foreign Ministry that a reinvigorated Prussia would be a natural ally for Britain, and such a shift would not bode well for Austria. On a more base note, both German powers were in competition for British cash to fund the war. A common problem for both was the long-feared rebellion in Poland. General Kosciuszko of American Revolutionary fame triggered an independence rebellion in Poland. Prussia had to send troops to fight the rebels, so too did the Austrians. This weakened the front lines in the Netherlands, where the Austrians and Prussians hoped the British would take up the slack. But it was not to be. Despite maintaining 60,000 superb troops, the British were reluctant to send any more to the continent after York's bloody nose at Hondershut. There's an apt old saying of the wars of this period: the British will fight to the last drop of Austrian blood. So needless to say, the coalition's command was at crossed purposes at the worst possible moment. Though vaguely aware of these problems, the French themselves felt unready to launch their offensive. Carnot's plans to reinforce the northern armies and break the Austrians were hampered by lack of food. Simply put, the longer they remained in France, draining their own resources, the closer the coalition came to literally starving them out. Robert Linday's Committee of Commerce and Supply decreed on May 13th that occupied lands would be thoroughly looted by so-called evacuation committees. It was their job to systematize the process of forced requisitions and confiscation of valuables. But these plans hinged upon the campaign. Fighting had been escalating since April. The Austrians under Coburg and the Anglo-Hanoverians under York pulled out all the stops to keep control over a small salient centered on the fort of Valenciennes. By month's end, the French had taken a key fort themselves. It's here that Carnot's plan for a double envelopment was put into action. Pichegru would attack over the Sambre and then push west. The army of the Ardennes would support him from the north, as Jourdan, at the head of the army of the Moselle, would break the Austrian lines in the south, and surge up through their rear lines before taking Liège and Namur. Even before the plan could commence, further fighting around the Valenciennes pocket had broken out, and the French weren't doing too well. Saint-Just and his colleague, career soldier Joseph Lebas, was sent to organise things on the eve of the offensive. They arrived on April 29th, the day Pichegru captured the vital fort that opened up the entire region. Buoyed by further and optimistic reports, Saint-Just ordered Pichegru on foolhardy assaults. After much difficulty, he finally crossed over the Sambre in late May. For a week or so he held out, but had to withdraw. Saint-Just demanded Jourdan to forget his own attack and joined Pichegru's army. But Jourdan refused, knowing that Carnot would burst a blood vessel if he learned that the southern attack was called off. Now fearing a loss of initiative, Saint-Just raced back to Paris and entreated Robespierre to get the committee to follow his advice. He got a version of what he wanted. Carnot agreed that the armies of the Moselle and North would be amalgamated as the famous Army of the Sambre at Meuse. However, against his wishes, Jourdan was put in overall command. Officially, the Army of the Sambre at Meuse was only formed on June 8th on Carnot's order, but that didn't stop Saint-Just racing ahead with the news 2 days early. A dual offensive was launched the next day, but again the Sambre proved impassable. Jourdan was a tenacious bugger though. Over 90,000 of his troops cracked the lines on June 18th. Some besieged Charleroi, while the rest surged north like a flood across the lowlands. Pichegru broke out about the same time, descending upon Ypres, which he allowed to surrender with the full honours of war. The stunning French breakout around the Sambre obliged York and Coburg to retreat. When this news reached Francis II of Austria, a bad military situation became a strategic catastrophe. The Emperor was physically in the region, and he had been since April, even visiting Valenciennes in May. Advice from his rather reactionary ministers led him to believe that the war was now lost. New orders went out to Coburg for him to cut east into Germany, where he might be safe. Charleroi, meanwhile, was on the verge of surrender. Negotiations with Saint-Just were brief. The garrison wanted a conditional surrender to leave with the full honours of war as had happened at Ypres. However, Saint-Just refused, saying that what he wanted was, quote, not paper, but the town. Taking the hint, Charleroi capitulated on the 26th. Had they waited even a few hours longer, perhaps Charleroi might have held. Because Coburg, brave but foolish, defied the Emperor's orders and returned to aid his encircled men. After splitting off a force to screen Pichegru near Ypres, Coburg coordinated with his allies. The Prince of Orange was ordered to cease his attempts at containing Jean Ferrand and join in with the attack from the west. General Beaulieu, who had been held in reserve, was also ordered to join the attack. Between all three armies, Coburg believed that he had the strength to score a decisive counterblow, to break Jourdan against the Sambre. Upon this upcoming battle did the fate of nations depend. On the 25th, the day before the battle, General Jourdan had taken a flight in a hot air balloon, a new technology pioneered by the Montgolfier brothers and employed by the Corps Aerostatique. With it he surveyed the next day's battlefield. Having taken Charleroi, his army had ranged a few miles north and stretched out in a wide semicircle to cover the city. The defences on the left flank under Jean-Baptiste Kléber centred on the town of Trajany. Championnet held the heavily forested centre, and Lefebvre and Marceau held the right, their lines established around the little village of Fleurus. All told, the French had around 70,000 troops and 100 pieces of artillery, all dug in on favourable ground. Against them were approximately 52,000 coalition troops. After recent defeats, Coburg's own force was reduced to about 10,000 men. Beaulieu bumped those numbers up to around 20,000. Reinforcements from the Prince of Orange and lingering imperial corps made up the rest. These forces Coburg divided into 5 columns. The plan of attack was simple, a double envelopment that would rush the river and capture the crossings. Orange took the far left, 2 columns were placed in the centre, and on the right was the main Austrian force, one column led by Beaulieu and another by Archduke Charles. Each of these columns arrived at the battlefield separately over the night of the 25th, and even then only after a forced march. Coalition troops would fight already exhausted. The columns began their advance around 4 or 5 a.m, after a perfunctory breakfast. Unfortunately for Coburg, Jourdan was well aware of the developing attack. Between intelligence from the light cavalry and his vantage point in the balloon, Jourdan knew pretty well what was going on. However, he severely overestimated the strength of the coalition army, and so gave his corps commanders permission to cede ground should they feel it necessary, rather than trying to hold back the tide. First shots had been fired not long after midnight. Further skirmishing occurred all along the line as the coalition columns drew up into their attack positions. Battle began in earnest around 9 a.m. when Beaulieu commenced his assault upon Marceau on the extreme right flank. Despite strong resistance, the Austrian column forced its way through lines of French defence. As all that was happening, Lefebvre was struggling to contain Charles, who overran Fleurus mid-morning. Over the next few hours, Marceau was beaten back and lost a valuable redoubt at Baratre. Lefebvre dispatched Jean Soult, yes that Soult, to assess Marceau's situation. He reported that Marceau was making a valiant stand, and he was correct. By midday, the right flank was holding, if only by the skin of their teeth. The left flank wasn't looking much better. Advanced elements of Orange's column outflanked the defenders of Trajany, forcing their commander to retreat. Dutch soldiers chased the retreating French right to the Sambre. But here the French rallied and managed to hold. Other crossings were protected by a tenacious defence at the heights of La Espinette. By around 10 a.m, Kléber's situation was dire but stable. With Orange unable to complete his mission, Kléber launched a surprise counterattack. He divided his reserves between himself, Jean Bernadotte, and General Duhamel. Acting in concert, they forced a crossing of the Sambre at 11 a.m. Of all the French defences, those in the centre held best. Championnet held back 2 Austrian columns for 4 hours, until he felt forced to give ground with Lefebvre. Even so, the French defence was excellent, and Championnet stayed put. By the middle of the day, the French were counter-attacking on the left, holding the centre and yielding on the right. Jourdan observed all of this from Jumet Hill, having come down from his balloon sometime in the morning. He got to watch as Championnet was picked apart by cannon fire, and with Jourdan's ascent, he began to pull back. This was only halted when, between 2 and 3 p.m., the French right flank began a series of counterattacks. Some were successful, some were not, but they gave the centre some breathing room, and Championnet counterattacked himself, driving the Austrians back. In similar fashion, Kleber's counterattack had worked wonders. The Dutch were reeling, and Orange issued a retreat in late afternoon. The centre followed not long after. And though Beaulieu tried to regroup and get stuck in, he too admitted defeat around 5 p.m. Coburg's order for a general retreat northward to Waterloo arrived shortly thereafter. With the coalition in flight and the French still holding the field, the 16-hour-long Battle of Fleurus was a clear French victory. Like all such victories, however, the toll in blood was abysmal. Several thousand dead and wounded on either side. Having sustained such heavy losses, Jourdan was unable to immediately capitalise on his success, and lingered on in Charleroi for a few days. Saint-Just, on the other hand, didn't wait a moment. Even before the fighting was done, he had requisitioned a coach and sped back to Paris.